Welcome back to episode 16. Now, this video is a re-upload of the original episode 16, which happened because a few days after I uploaded the original one, I realized that basically all of the audio clips had gone missing and had not made it into the final cut, which I think was due to me forgetting to do something in DaVinci. Um, and then I came back into the file and I found that all of the audio clips had been lost to the recycling bin, and I could no longer access them. So I'm just going to basically go back over the video clips and try to emulate what I said in the previous ones to the best of my abilities. I think this also happened to episode 17, uh, which is really unfortunate, and I'm very sorry that that happened. But this here is a payload that is going to go onto this station, the Skylab, which is coming up behind us there. And you can see in the Kerbal Engineer, this vessel is the power module. So this is going to be the first time that we're really going into the beamed power. We've gone high enough in the tech tree that we're starting to get into some of the interstellar technologies. And this will be kind of a testing bed for using them and figuring out how they all work, because there's a lot of technologies and probably a lot of things that I need to learn how to use them. So the beam tower, of course, is you can generate power through a variety of sources. Currently, the only one that I have available to me is solar power, but in the future, we'll be able to unlock nuclear reactors and various types of generation and more advanced storage and transmission. But basically, you can turn the heat or electrical energy generated by various sources into megajoules, which is something you can see in the resources tab on the upper right there. But basically, you can use these megajoules for various things. You can receive them to do, there's certain parts and engines that will use them for power and thrust and things like that. And you can beam these megajoules around space using microwaves or various frequencies of light. And yeah, you can basically just have wireless power networks that will power all of your crazy cool spaceships. The only problem is that a lot of these higher level technologies tend to be very expensive, which means I'll have to do a lot of contracts to get enough funds to actually use them properly. So in this fairing, it's a 3.75 meter fairing to fit the large payload, and that causes some problems because these are 2.5 meter parts, and as soon as we throttle up that upper stage, we lose it. And yeah, so the whole thing just kind of comes apart under the aerodynamics there. I think the infernal robotics is most of what happened. You can see it dancing around and flopping like some crazy dancy floppy thing. Um, so those were 3.75 meter fairings to fit all this in there. But we don't have 3.75 meter tanks, so I had stitched together something with 2.5 and 1.25 meter parts, uh, and it clearly was not stable enough at 20 kilometers of altitude. And the spin, I think, made the robotic parts kind of flop around. This is something I've noticed when you chain a bunch of the infernal robotics parts together, they tend to not do well under stress. Um, just like me, honestly. They will kind of just flop around and get all crazy and weird, like they're doing now. So this thing is just going to fall into the ocean and scatter whatever toxic heavy metal components go into the electronics. And now it's folded up, you can actually kind of see what I was going for there a little bit better. So unplanned surprise reveal. But we're just going to let this fall into the ocean because no engines, no parachutes. This thing was not supposed to come back into the atmosphere. So yeah, that was very unfortunate. We'll have to make some designs to the revisions to the launch vehicle. And yeah, now you can really start to see what this thing was going to look like as we plow into the ocean at a appreciable fraction of the speed of sound. And there we go. And some of it survived, but not the important bits. And there it goes. In the meantime, the prune, its time has come for it to make its final orbital insertion. It has about 62 meters per second of delta V, which is not enough to do anything useful in this orbit. I mean, we could probably chase down Gilly again, but really, That's not what I want to do. I want to park this into a high orbit around Eve, one that will not intersect with Gilly, and then it will just sit here. It will be able to provide us science, which will fulfill us some of those science from space around contracts. And it will also serve as a relay for the space around Eve. So now, just pausing for a moment to appreciate the beauty of Eve and the sun there, orienting the solar panels so that it will not run its batteries dry, and a quick beauty shot. Now it is time for our second attempt of launching the power module. This time I've put some boosters on the side. That will get us high enough in the atmosphere once we go onto the liquid engine in the center there. And that way, when we can ditch the first stage, we should be more in a regime where the aerodynamics will have less of an effect when we go on to the second stage. But just in case they don't, I've put some fins on there as well to help keep the whole thing stable. So we're just going to fly this up. These are the boosters from the KW pack, which provide us a good 2.5-ish Gs of acceleration, but burn very quickly, which I think is pretty accurate to how solid engines behave in the real world. Of course, solid boosters are very powerful, very cheap, but have almost no control, which is why when original designs for the space shuttle were being drawn up, many people were skeptical, to say the least, about using them for a crewed vehicle, given their raw power and complete lack of controllability. So we now are on that liquid stage there, and that will get us high enough in the atmosphere that we'll be able to go on to the second stage, and we can then rendezvous with the station. That there is not the station. That is a piece of debris, Minmus Lander 1 debris, and it should actually be in the atmosphere based on the distance that it's saying. Yeah, 70 kilometers away, and it looks to be behind us. So it's definitely inside the atmosphere. So we'll probably have to track that through and watch it burn up at some point. But the station, Skylab, is a good bit behind us, which means we're going to have to go into something of a higher orbit to let it catch up below us so we can do a nice slow rendezvous with it. There's also that squad label that is left over from the vehicle assembly building, I believe, and I couldn't figure out a way to get rid of it. So, yeah, that thing is very close. It's like 25 kilometers, and we're at 15 kilometers. So that puts it at about 40 kilometers of altitude. So, yeah, that's definitely deep enough in the atmosphere that it should burn up. But that is not our concern. That will be its concern. And it cannot be concerned because it is probably just a spent stage or something like that. Speaking of spent stages, we have 500 meters per second left in this one. And we just go up with it, let it expend the rest of its fuel. And there we go. So we're high enough that the fins should probably not have much use. But we're still going to let ourselves drift up to about 50 kilometers anyways before staging. And we have full aerodynamic stability, full control of this. So we can pitch down and start our journey into orbit. These tanks on the side, I put them there to help ease the seam between the 3.75 meter fairing and the 2.5 meter fuel tanks. But they are drop tanks, so once those have run dry, I can get rid of them, and we will now, shortly, we will be on a more efficient, more Delta V stage. So just about 10 units of fuel left in those. So we're just going to let them go soon enough. And there they go. So now cut the throttle so that there's no strange issues. And we can also deploy the fairing now. And something explodes. It was the megajoule supercapacitors. I had 4 of them. Now there's just 3. But you can see there are these arrays here. And what these do is they store electric charge and megajoules. And they also allow me to convert between them, which means I can take the electrical charge coming in from the panels and convert them into megajoules that can then be used for other purposes. So now coming up into a higher orbit, about 10 kilometers above the space station, And we'll be pretty close already, so we won't have to spend too much time drifting around in orbit. We'll extend the antenna now so that we have full control of this at all times. And I'm going to hold off on extending the solar panels because we have enough electric charge in here to last for several orbits. And honestly, I don't want to, deploy anything too early to kind of ruin the surprise. Although you can probably get an idea. It's those robotic hinges that are all folded up together in there, chained together on structural beams. And we've actually passed our apoapsis a good bit. So I start burning upwards to kill my vertical speed because I do want to stay above the space station. So that way I'm in a higher orbit and I will be going slower than it so that it can catch up to me below us. And so just finishing up this burn, we were already pretty close to orbit. So just letting myself get higher. And yeah, now it's time for us to wait, catch up a whole bunch of orbits. We'll have to do a plane change. 0.4 degrees is significant. It's pretty small, but it will be a big enough difference to make it or break my rendezvous. So we just warp there and nullify the relative inclination. And now we just let it catch up. And you can see, yep, we've got it nice and close. So I'm going to make a maneuver to get that down to 0, as close to 0 as I can. And you can see my relative speed will be fairly low once we get in close. And that's the benefit of doing a rendezvous like this, is the relative speeds will be small. Small enough that you can cancel them out quickly using RCS and not have to worry about flying past the target. Although I am going to keep this stage on just in case we need to, just in case we need it. There is still a ton of fuel left in this, and probably all of it's going to go into just deorbiting, but I want to, get as much worth out of it as I can. And now we just warp until we are close to the space station. So from here, it should look like we are kind of falling onto it, or rather that it is rising up to meet us. Although really we are just in our separate orbits and we are converging at a mutual altitude. So now coming in close, going to try to kill off some of that speed just a little bit, bring our encounter closer. And now that we are within the magical 2.2 kilometers, we're close enough that we can actually see it. So kill off the rest of that speed and get ourselves on a trajectory close to it. And now that we are within 500 meters, we'll soon be able to jettison this stage. So now looking at this, I want to try to decide what docking port I want to go for. And I'm probably just going to go for this one here because it's the closest. So we'll probably have to continue building out crude sections along the other side of it. But that shouldn't be too much of an issue. And there is a docking port on both ends of this. And that is mostly just because I want to bring the actual microwave transducer and dock that onto the end of this at some point in the future. So now, just using the last bit of fuel in this stage before we can ditch it, slowing down a tiny bit more. Of course, it is generally bad practice to fire your engines directly at a space station full of delicate things like solar panels. But this is Kerbal Space Program, we don't care about that stuff. Of course, when doing real rendezvous with the ISS and all other sorts of things, they very carefully plot out their orbits and calculate all of the proximity operations, so that way, when they're doing their final approaches, they never have to fire their thrusters directly at the space station, and can instead just kind of, put themselves into orbit around the station, relatively speaking, and on a course that will eventually just drift them in together until they're right up next to the docking port. There's a whole bunch of complicated math and orbital mechanics that I have no idea how they do, but it is all fairly fascinating stuff. But of course, here we can, afford to come into docking ports at 50 meters per second and then slow down with giant rocket engines firing onto the solar panels because it's a game. But I like to, go and try to be a little more gentle with my approaches because I honestly like the challenge. So now coming in nice and slow for our docking. I need to make sure to line them up properly because I don't want these solar panels to shade large parts of the space station. So now just 8 meters out, small station, but we will make some expansions to it, and this will be a very large module once it's fully deployed in terms of just visually um, how big it is. I think this main core section is technically larger than this, but because it's all the solar panels, it's going to look much bigger. 4 meters out, just drifting in nice and slow. Lots of delicate parts on this. Of course, when they were docking with the space shuttle, they were going the equivalent of, I think, about 0.05 or something like that. Very slow, about 1 or 2 inches per second when they were docking, because the space shuttle was a very large, very heavy vehicle. And if you go in too fast, then it would create a very big bump that would be very noticeable and probably would disturb some components of the space station. But again, we don't care about that. So now, very close. Magnets should start pulling us, and there we go. So now that we are docked, the first thing I'm going to do is deploy some of these radiators because we will be accumulating waste heat, and I want to get rid of that. Solar panels do accumulate a lot of heat from, trying to absorb the sun as best as they can. So we extend those radiators, and already this thing is looking much larger. So now, I think this is the first time we're really seeing use from the robotics, from Infernal Robotics. So I'm going to extend these arms. You can watch them fold out there. And all along the sides, I've got those, the largest solar panels that we can have at this time. I'm not sure if there are any larger ones in the game. So we wait for them to fully extend out. And I'm going to do that before extending any of the panels. Let this thing truly reach its majesty. And yeah, there they go there. Almost straightened, and I think that's good. Yeah, 90 degrees on all of them. And now we can see if my action groups have been hooked up correctly. There we go. Now, they are not very well aligned, so I will probably have to rotate this just a little bit. But that will provide us... this array here is probably enough power for the whole entire station. I think it will be a while before I have to make any extensions to my power supply here. But it will also be enough to generate a good supply of megajoules and let us beam that all around the place. Quick beauty shot there. It is shading a large part of the station, but that's fine. And now, gratuitous re-entry footage. We expend all of the fuel to get us in a high parabolic arc, one that completely burns up the debris. Now, we have recently unlocked scanning technology, and what I have here, you can see is called dual launcher. That's because there are 2 space probes in here. One of them I'm going to keep in a polar orbit around Kerbin, and the other one I'm going to send on a solar orbit, and we'll see why in a moment. But I want to get into a nice high polar orbit just because that's the best one for scanning things. The planet will be rotating under us, and we'll get full coverage over the course of several days and several orbits. So burning out the last of that stage there, and you can see the 2 satellites now. There's one at the bottom. That will be the one that stays in orbit around Kerbin. Getting my apoapsis up to about 300 kilometers. So we can analyze the magnetosphere using the interstellar magnetometer, which is a different one than the stock magnetometer. That one will provide us information about antimatter flux, which will be useful when we get higher up in the tech tree. So now circularizing here, burning off the rest of this stage. And once we are circularized, we can get to deploying these other satellites. So now we can scan for gamma rays. I believe what the gamma ray spectroscopy, that experiment is supposed to do, is tell us about the concentrations of radioactive elements in the surface of the planet we are orbiting. So deploy all the radiators, all the solar panels. And now this one here, this is what's going to stay behind in Kerbin orbit. So we deploy this orbital survey scanner, and now we can perform the orbital survey. Of course, we run out of power, so we have to let the batteries recharge and allow partial transmissions. And we just let this thing kind of chug through. I didn't put a lot of batteries on here, which was a bit of a problem, but you know, we can just beam the rest of this back with no issue. Now that's that done, we can see the ore concentrations on Kerbin. And now this one here has the infrared Sentinel telescope, which is based on the Sentinel infrared asteroid observation telescope that was proposed by the B612 Foundation. I don't think it ever launched, although I could be wrong on that. But basically, it would sit in an orbit of a bit higher than Venus's orbit, and just scan for asteroids, for near-Earth asteroids. And we're going to do a similar thing with that. We can find asteroids and comets, and there are contracts to just passively detect those, which will be another source of gradual income for us. But we get it on a solar orbit, and we'll have to circularize it in the future. And just watch this thing drift off into interplanetary space. Now we can perform the orbital survey, start monitoring objects, and we will have to see these technologies be used in future episodes. Until next time.